I was gonna try to make an introduction when it comes to me reviewing this episode, but at the same time, it's really difficult to actually do an introduction when it comes to episodes that people don't usually review a lot. And I'm saying that if an episode is either mediocre or bad, I can't do any of that. And this episode is considered good for my book. So, yeah, for an episode called Go Goo Go, which is a creative episode title, I really got nothing to start off with when I usually show you the title card and then me getting straight to the episode. But then again, everyone is having a difficult time on doing introductions when it comes to the reviews, some of the reviews that is. So anyway, what is this episode about? Well, Mac was about to get a sled that Blue has up in the tree, and this ended up causing Mac to fall down to the ground, while also his backpack was completely ripped apart. And he completely encountered Goo, who is the additional who makes her debut in this show. And if this is the first time you ever watch this episode or this review, then you might need to understand that Goo is completely a chatterbox, basically. She completely talks so many times to the point that no one can understand her, and it gets really annoying. And when it comes to her imaginary friends, she completely says the same thing with only one tweak to it, which in this screenshot involves orange blues with different clones, just with different changes. Yeah. And if you probably haven't figured it out, Mr. Hellman and Frankie wants Goo away from the apartment or the foster's home where all the imaginary friends are living. Believe me, this is the reasons, these are one of these strict rules that Mac and Blue needs to learn. Well, Mac at least. And during the middle of the episode, Blue invites Goo over, and this leads to so much psychotic chaos between Goo, where she completely encounters Wilt, Eduardo, and Coco, and with her imaginary powers, just like everyone else, she causes chaos around the apartment rooms of the building. And believe me, I really can feel the stress and pain from the other characters because they just cannot handle the chatterbox that is Goo herself. But that doesn't mean that she's hateable, because we're in the middle of this episode and we're only halfway there. But that's where I'm going to stop talking about the story. When it comes to the supporting characters of the show, I really don't have fan favorites whatsoever. This show was just basically one of my least favorite. Not saying that it's terrible, I mean least favorite, like in Under NNA and other cartoons that I did enjoy during the time when I was under 10 years old. Not saying that the characters in the show are unmemorable, but when it comes to the development and how the writers is just trying to make these characters a little bit more likable, I honestly think that Goo is probably the best I've seen from all the other characters I've seen from this show. As for her debut in this episode, when it comes to Mac encountering her, it's mostly something that characters appear out of the blue, which is something that for these cartoons it actually works, since that when it comes to 22-minute episodes, they usually try to add some seriousness and also have some kind of continuity, which the show also does. But when it comes to shows like Friendship is Magic and maybe other shows that you're probably familiar with, there's always a serious continuum when it comes to character developments. Here, however, we only get a character development from Goo, and as for the rest of the episodes later on, she just makes appearances, but just trying to be there for fan service or something. But that doesn't mean that her character isn't really that bad. For one thing, in the first half of this episode, Mac is just completely confused on what Goo really is, and then when he actually sees on how many imaginary friends that she's making in a span of a few seconds, That really goes to show how Mr. Hellman and Frankie want her out of Foster's. I can honestly tell that my opinions on most of the characters, mainly Frankie and Hellman, are mostly mixed. I mean, they're likable, and I actually found them a bit useful in this episode, but when it comes to other episodes, that's for another time. But I can understand that the motivations in this episode is just something that they do not want to handle Goo, because we all know that Foster's isn't the hugest hotel, and I have no idea how the heck the other Foster's home, well, the other imaginary friends that Goo made went to. Not saying that they just completely threw them away or something, because as far as I'm concerned, they would never do that. But what I don't understand is, even though that there was an episode where Mac and Blue are completely lost in the building, I honestly doubt that there's so much spare rooms for imaginary friends to come in. And if there was a basement, which I think there was an episode based off of them going into the basement, which I don't think that's really what happened, but that, from my knowledge, I think that's what happened. I can really tell that still really explains a lot onto why they really want Goo away from the building. The havoc that she caused would honestly make you convinced that you should probably have her banned from the place. And it's really understandable that banning people exists for a reason, even if it happens onto different times or different situations. And whenever I actually see Goo in this, she is mostly irritating, but at the same time, she really just can't control herself until Mac completely decides to have a conversation with her after the argument that they have, but I'm gonna get to that later. If you want to know onto why Goo kept going back and back to Foster's, it's because of Blue, because with the screenshot I show you of Blue and Goo completely making a horse together, that really sums up everything. And as far as I'm concerned, it really got a lot of out of control to the point that the main characters, mainly Frankie and Max's imaginary friends, not the friends that he created, but the friends that he's familiar with, were all sleeping in the bus. Yeah, that really goes to show that they couldn't take it. And considering the fact that the entire building is completely filled with the imaginary friends that Goo made, that really shows a lot. But before I get to the ending, sorry, there's so much to discuss, let's go talk about the mini plot involving Mac and Goo being boyfriend and girlfriend, which doesn't really add to anything, especially after this episode. Now, Frankie and Mr. Hellman think that the reasons onto why Goo keeps coming back is because they saw Mac holding hands with her. And at this point, it's starting to become really forced at this point. Yes, I get that the whole misunderstanding is something that cartoons usually do, but at the same time, even after watching this episode and when I got older, that's one of the issues I have. In this episode, it gets really, really irritating whenever I actually think of characters thinking that Mac is Goo's boyfriend. And as far as I'm concerned, since that they never brought it up again, they barely did anything to continue with it, because they pretty much know how meaningless this was. Yes, this is supposed to be a plot device involving Goo keep coming back to Foster's again and again, but if you're gonna have the other characters completely argue about Mac about this, then at the very least, you should really understand that this isn't really going to make them likable in this episode. The motivations in this episode make sense, I understand, but when it comes to this cliche that we've been seeing for so many times, it can get really, really annoying. Now, yes, I get it. Holding hands may be a misunderstanding, but at the same time, Mac was just trying to be nice. He's been nice to all throughout the beginning of the episode until we reach to the very end. But when it comes to the moment where they want Mac to be banned from Foster's just like Goo was, I honestly think that that's just mostly hammering in. I mean, granted, the scene is good, but at the same time, it's still hammering in. When it comes to McCracken's shows, I can understand that it's his style and he's just trying to actually make the style work for his shows, but at the same time, it's not going to impress so many people like I do. Granted, it's something that the people who live in Foster's want no part of, but at the same time, considering the fact that they've known Mac since the very first episode and how responsible Mac is, I honestly think that they should really consider on how Mac can handle the situation. Even if they dealt with the same situation involving Goo in the past, you really need to understand that having Goo coming back for so many times in the span of holidays, and I'm not making this up, there was a small montage of Goo coming back while completely talking at full speed like a chatterbox, like I said earlier, while the weather changes to July, Halloween, autumn, which is what we're at right now if I upload this video before or after autumn, but still, I honestly think that they should probably consider that Blue was behind all this. And since that Frankie is actually aware that Blue did some of this stuff in the past, especially that this episode came out after the Make 'em Up Pals episode, this really shows that Frankie should be aware that Blue completely caused all this. Yes, Mac allowed Goo to be in the building, but he didn't know that. But at the second time, and possibly the many times, it will probably be Blue's responsibility. And considering that Blue gets meaner and more greedier as each season passes, I'm mostly not looking forward to reviewing the future episodes involving Blue himself. Granted, I was a fan of him, but at the same time, I honestly don't know what the friendship thing was going on with Cartoon Network shows. Don't completely argue with me about Mr. Mysterious Mentor, because I still watch his content and I still subscribe to him. Just don't judge me. Anyway, let's get towards the end of this episode while Mac actually snaps. As far as I'm concerned, it's really obvious that a bullying play has to happen in these episodes, but unlike the episodes I've seen from Friendship is a Magic where there has to be a boiling point and a lashing out moment, I honestly think that this episode actually does it right, and it's something that I can actually relate to. Throughout this entire episode, we all know how annoying Goo is, and as far as I'm concerned, I honestly think that everything that's what's been going on is honestly his whole obsession of just going to Foster's and completely going cuckoo crazy, which explains onto why Mac said that no one likes you. But this eventually completely hurt Goo to the point that she runs away while also giving Mac the box, which actually reveals to be Mac's backpack that has been fixed. Throughout the majority of this episode, Mac had to carry his things since that he wasn't able to use his backpack. That is actually something that's actually something that you probably don't expect a character to do like Goo does. And she also wrote a message to Mac for being so nice to her. If there was ever going to be a future cartoon episode where it's going to involve a cartoon character making its debut and acting cuckoo crazy and stuff like that, then they should take notes and inspiration from this episode, especially on how they actually make Goo really redeemable when it comes to her emotional sadness after the lashing from Mac. Believe me, I honestly think that these were the episodes that I actually enjoyed, but I didn't know much about considering that I was too young. And then when I watch this episode again, I really can see onto what they're trying to do. And considering that most of the writers from this show were from Lauren Faust, who will later to do My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic in the next decade, that really shows a lot onto how this episode became a lot more good than I thought it would be. The conversation between Goo and Mac really goes to show onto why Goo is the way she is, and the fact that she's really upset. She has her reasons onto why she completely makes imaginary friends constantly. It's because she barely has any friends around her because of who she is. And considering that this has been going on for how many months or so between her encounters with Frankie and Mr. Hellman, I can really tell that this is an episode that other characters, the people in the real world who have the same issues as Goo, will relate to Goo. I can understand that it's honestly something that you cannot improve yourself and honestly make everyone impressed of who you really are because of how annoying you are. But at the same time, the fact that Mac actually mentions that the imaginary friends that she created was actually creative, which I think that was one of the words that Max said in this episode, and actually something that Goo can actually relate to, especially sticking to the ones that she actually enjoys the most, because let's be honest, even though that Goo is actually more really psychotic when it comes to making so many imaginary friends in this short amount of time, that is something that she needs to get used to. And besides, I think that the ending involving her friends or family, I think it's her family mostly, it's probably a great way to actually start things new, especially that she's actually allowed to be in fosters as long as she actually control his habit. I really enjoyed this episode, especially the introduction of Goo. Granted, this is the only time we actually get to see some development, but then again, if I watch future episodes of Goo, and I might do reviews of them, I'll try to actually see if there was actually development from her. Because even though that Fosters is a really great cartoon from Cartoon Network, it isn't like Friendship is Magic when it's actually something that has an arc, and they had to continue with that arc. I get that there might be arcs in this show, but when I actually watch these shows in the 2000s, I honestly think that arcs were not really much of a serious requirement. But then again, that's just basically me though. So I actually enjoyed this episode, and I actually enjoy Goo for the character she is. And as for Mac in this episode, he really did the right thing. And as for everything that we've seen after this episode involving Goo, the less said the better. I give Goo Goo Go a 7.5 out of 10.